It was a Friday night when the three friends, Tom, Sarah, and Michael, decided to sneak into their high school. The school was quiet and the corridors were dark, lit only by faint emergency lights. They weren't looking for trouble, just some excitement. The idea of exploring the empty school at night had seemed thrilling earlier in the day. Tom led the way as they quietly walked through the long, deserted hallway. Their footsteps echoed softly on the tiled floor. Sarah and Michael followed closely, glancing over their shoulders as if expecting to be caught at any moment. They reached the science wing, a part of the school that always felt eerie, even during the day. At night, it was worse. The shadows seemed deeper, and the air colder. Tom, always the boldest of the group, suggested they check out the biology lab. The door creaked as they opened it, and they stepped inside. It was pitch black, except for the small beams from their phone flashlights. The lab was filled with the usual desks, equipment, and cabinets. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the atmosphere was thick with tension. After a few minutes of walking around, Sarah suggested they leave. She was getting a strange feeling, as if someone, or something, was watching them. But Tom wanted to keep exploring. Michael, trying to be brave, sided with Tom. They moved to the back of the lab, where old storage cabinets lined the wall. Tom, ever curious, pulled open one of the cabinets. It was empty, except for a few dusty jars and papers. Sarah sighed in relief, ready to head out. But as they turned to leave, the door to the lab slammed shut behind them. Michael jumped and aimed his flashlight at the door. "It's just the wind," Tom muttered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The air in the room felt colder now, and the sound of their breathing seemed louder in the silence. Sarah moved toward the door to open it, but it wouldn't budge. She pushed and pulled, but the handle was stuck. "This isn't funny," she said, panic creeping into her voice. Michael joined her, trying to force the door open, but it wouldn't move an inch. Tom scanned the room with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. "There must be another way out," he said, though he wasn't sure. The windows were sealed tight, and the door was their only exit. Suddenly they heard a noise from the back of the room, a soft scraping sound. They froze, all three turning their lights in the direction of the sound. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, as if something was dragging itself across the floor. "Who's there?" Tom called, but there was no answer. The scraping grew louder. It seemed to be coming from the farthest corner, behind one of the cabinets. Michael, swallowing his fear, stepped toward it. Sarah grabbed his arm, whispering for him to stay back, but he shook her off. He couldn't let Tom think he was scared. As Michael approached the corner, his light flickered for a second, casting strange shadows on the walls. The scraping stopped. He stood still, his breath quick and shallow. Tom and Sarah stood frozen, watching him. Then, without warning, the scraping noise returned, louder this time. Michael spun around, his flashlight flickering wildly. But in the next moment, the light went out completely, plunging them into total darkness. "Michael!" Sarah shouted, her voice trembling. She fumbled with her phone, trying to turn the flashlight back on, but her hands were shaking. Tom called out for Michael too, but there was no response. The silence was deafening, broken only by their ragged breathing. Sarah's flashlight finally flickered back to life, and she pointed it where Michael had been standing. But he was gone. The corner was empty, the cabinet untouched. There was no sign of him, no trace that he had ever been there. "Michael!" Sarah screamed again, running to the spot where he had disappeared. Tom grabbed her, trying to pull her back, but she was frantic. "We need to find him!" she cried. But the room was still, and the scraping sound had stopped. The door, still locked, showed no sign of opening, and Michael was gone without a trace. They searched for him, calling his name over and over, but there was no answer. The lab was empty, and the cold silence swallowed their voices. Tom finally stopped, realizing that whatever had happened to Michael wasn't something they could explain. They eventually escaped the lab, but Michael was never found. The school was searched, the police were called, but there was no sign of him. To this day, Tom and Sarah don't talk about that night. They never went back to the science wing, and they never told anyone exactly what happened in that room. But they both know that whatever took Michael is still waiting in the dark, somewhere in that school. The old wing of Oakwood High was scheduled for demolition. It was a part of the school no one used anymore, with broken windows and peeling paint. Still, some teachers occasionally held detention there, in a room known as Room 34. It was an odd choice since the room was hidden away in a back corner, far from the main part of the school. One evening, a group of students was sent to detention for skipping class. There were 5 of them, and none seemed particularly concerned. They sat in Room 34, texting and chatting quietly. The teacher in charge of them left to grab some papers, promising to return shortly. Minutes passed, and the students grew bored. One of them, a boy named Sam, wandered around the room. He noticed a strange door at the back of the classroom. It looked old, much older than the rest of the building, and had a rusty handle. Out of curiosity, he tried the handle, but the door didn't budge. "Maybe it leads to an old storage closet," one of the others joked, but Sam wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about the door. The minutes turned into an hour, and the teacher still hadn't returned. The students began to get nervous. They tried texting their friends, but there was no signal in this part of the building. When they opened the classroom door to leave, they found the hallway beyond was dark, the lights flickering weakly. Sam suggested they stick together and wait, but the others disagreed. They began wandering down the hallway, hoping to find another way out. Sam stayed behind, standing in the doorway of Room 34. That was when he heard it, the faint sound of whispering. It wasn't coming from the hallway, but from the old door at the back of the room. He turned around and stared at the door. The whispering grew louder, though he couldn't make out any words. His heart pounded in his chest and his hands trembled as he took a step closer. Suddenly, the door swung open on its own, revealing a dark, empty space beyond. Sam screamed for his friends, but when he turned back to the hallway, they were gone. He ran outside, searching for them, but they had disappeared. The police were called, but the students were never found. The only clue left behind was the open door in Room 34, which was later sealed off when the building was demolished. Story 3. The Abandoned Gym. Greenfield High had a large, unused gym that was only open during exams or special events. It was a massive building with tall ceilings, metal bleachers, and dusty old equipment scattered around. The gym hadn't been used for years, but it was still part of the school's property, and sometimes students would sneak in, looking for adventure. One night, 3 students decided to break into the gym. They wanted to explore and take pictures for their social media pages. The school had been abandoned for hours, and it was the perfect time. They climbed through a broken window and found themselves in the middle of the empty gym, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The first few minutes were fun. They laughed, took photos, and dared each other to explore the darker corners. But soon, they noticed something strange. No matter how far they walked, they kept ending up back at the center of the gym. It was as if the space was looping, trapping them in an endless circle. At first, they thought it was just a coincidence, but the longer it went on, the more they realized something was wrong. The gym was cold, much colder than it had been when they first entered. The metal bleachers creaked as if someone was walking on them, but when they turned their flashlights in that direction, they saw nothing. One of the students suggested leaving, but when they tried to find the exit, the door they had come through was gone. In its place was a blank wall. Panic set in as they ran to the other side of the gym, only to find more walls, no doors, no windows, just cold, empty space. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. They couldn't tell. Their flashlights began to flicker, and the sounds of footsteps grew louder, closer. Desperate, they tried breaking through the walls, but it was no use. The gym had swallowed them, and no one ever saw them again. The next morning, the school staff found the gym in its usual state, empty, quiet, with no sign of anyone having been there the night before. But the students' families reported them missing, and despite searches, no trace was ever found. The gym was eventually closed for good, but the stories of what happened there remained, haunting the memories of those who had once played inside its walls. The school was deserted, its halls filled with an eerie silence. Mr. Benson had been assigned the night watch for the exam period, a task he had reluctantly accepted. The building always felt different after dark. Too quiet, too still. But it was just one night. By morning, it would all be over. He started his rounds, his footsteps echoing faintly in the long, dark hallways. The faint glow of emergency lights barely illuminated his path. As he passed by the gym, he heard a faint creak. He paused, straining to listen, but there was nothing else. Just the normal sounds of an old building. He shook it off, telling himself it was nothing. Mr. Benson continued through the science wing. The air felt colder here, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. His flashlight flickered briefly, but it remained steady enough to push through his growing unease. As he moved past a row of classrooms, something caught his eye. Movement at the far end of the hall, near the old storage room. He stopped, aiming his flashlight down the hallway. Nothing moved. Yet the uneasy feeling persisted. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he took a few cautious steps forward, peering into the darkness. The faint glow of the light barely penetrated the gloom, and for a moment, he could have sworn he saw something shift in the corner of his vision. Suddenly, a door slammed shut behind him, the noise exploding in the quiet hallway. He spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing. His breath came faster as he shone his flashlight in every direction, trying to calm himself. The shadows danced, but the hallway was empty. He rushed to the stairwell, his footsteps quickening. His hand gripped the cold railing as he descended, but halfway down, a new sound reached his ears. A soft, slow creaking, like something dragging itself across the floor. His heart skipped a beat. He turned his head toward the noise. From the top of the stairs, something dark moved. At first, he couldn't make out what it was, just a shadow sliding across the floor. But then, it began to take form. It wasn't human, just a black, shifting mass, creeping toward him with deliberate slowness. Panic gripped him. Mr. Benson bolted down the stairs, his feet barely touching the steps. His flashlight flickered again, casting erratic beams of light. He reached the ground floor, sprinting toward the front doors. His breath was ragged, his chest tight with fear. When he reached the doors, he yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't move. He pulled harder, desperation setting in. But the door was locked tight. He pounded his fists against the door, shouting for help, but his voice echoed uselessly in the empty halls. The sound of something dragging itself along the floor returned. Louder now. Closer. He turned, his back pressed against the door, as the shadowy mass crept down the stairwell. It moved slowly, yet it was relentless, coming toward him like a thick fog. His mind screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The whispers began then, soft, unintelligible, but filled with something dark and malicious. The shadow closed in, just feet away now, and the whispers grew louder, filling his ears, invading his thoughts. His legs trembled as he felt the cold presence wrap around him. The air was thick, suffocating. His vision blurred, and his knees buckled. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the shadow looming over him, the whispers filling his mind, drowning out his thoughts. The next morning, Mr. Benson's body was found near the entrance, eyes wide open in terror. The police could find no sign of forced entry, no clue as to what had happened. But the fear etched into his face told a different story, one that would never be fully understood. From that night on, no one stayed late at the school. Rumors spread about what Mr. Benson had seen, about the shadow that lurked in the empty halls. No one could explain it, but everyone agreed on one thing. Something was still there, waiting in the dark for the next person to be alone at night.